toxic masculinity.
Lockdowns create alcoholism epidemic in the UK. So in the UK, we have seen this massive rise in alcoholism ever since the lockdown started. Oops. All right, there we go. Alcohol deaths in England and Wales rise to a 20-year high during the pandemic. Let's see here. Why is there a big S? I think they messed that up. Is that S for share? That doesn't make any sense. All right. The number of people dying of alcoholism consumption reached a 20-year high during the CCP virus epidemic. They call it the CCP virus. I love it. So it's not called the China virus, I guess? I don't know. Official figures for England and Wales have shown, according to new data released on Thursday by the Office of National Statistics, 7,423 people in England and Wales died of alcohol-specific causes in 2020. The highest annual total since 2001. That sucks. The number was 19.6% higher than 2019, during which 6,209 people were killed by alcohol. It was also the highest annual death toll for 20 years. The steep rise in alcohol-related deaths appears to have been related to the CCP virus pandemic. The ONS said that from January to March, before the first national COVID-19 lockdown began, the death rate from alcohol abuse was statistically similar to rates from previous years. However, over the rest of 2020, after the lockdown began, the death rate became significantly higher. And so you have this issue where the cure is worse than the disease, right? Is worse than the problem. So, and this is something that we were warned about. I mean, Trump warned about this fairly early on. People were like, oh, we need to do all these crazy measures. And Trump said, look, you don't want the cure to be worse than the problem. And, obviously the left criticizes him for saying stuff like that. But that's absolutely true. It doesn't really matter if you're a Republican or you're a Democrat. You'd never want the cure to be worse than the problem ever. I mean, Democrats don't care just so long as they stay in power, obviously. But, from a philosophical perspective, it shouldn't matter what your political party is. That's just correct. At no point should, you get a splinter in your toe and your doctor cut off your leg, right? That's not an appropriate cure. It's worse than the original problem. So, and that's what we're doing, right? And I made a whole video about how lockdowns don't work, right? About how, because they've discovered now that, and this is a video I'm going to put out soon, they've discovered now that sunlight actually destroys the virus, I think something like 5 times faster than they thought it would originally or something like that. So sunlight basically just disinfects things immediately. And also the virus doesn't seem to last very long outside at night either. So it's not just sunlight. I mean, there's a variety of causes. But the point is that, in the summer months especially, because sunlight is such a great disinfectant of COVID, the sunlight should reduce the numbers during the summer. We were hoping that would happen last summer. It didn't. And it's possible, at least in part, that the reason that it didn't is because everybody was staying inside, right? Whether you had the virus or not, everybody was staying inside. And that's really where the virus spreads. The virus really spreads inside. So if you lock everybody inside, that could potentially be very counterproductive, right? Obviously some people have to leave their houses. We still need grocery stores to operate and stuff like that. But this idea that people should stay inside, the video that I produced, if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. It's a pretty good video because I showcase how at least one police office in the United Kingdom, they got these drones and they would go out into the countryside and they would video people who were walking their dogs and they were out for hikes during the pandemic, and they posted like a Twitter video with all these messages that said like, this hike is not an essential travel. You don't need to be outside here walking around. Like, you don't need to be outside enjoying the sunshine. It's like, guys, you can't catch the virus outside. It's almost impossible. It's like very, very unlikely you're going to catch the virus outside. Especially now, one thing that struck me as particularly well, so I was surprised was that what we call casual encounters, right? Like walking by somebody. I had not heard the statistic before, but the number of people who had actually been infected or have been recorded to have been infected by somebody jogging past someone or walking past someone outside, zero. There was no recorded incidence of this ever for COVID. So there was some speculation that a viral that could spread very easily might spread this way. But over the course of the pandemic, they realized it can't. And so in hindsight, we realized that, in fact, stopping people from going on hiking trails and stuff like that was a terrible thing to do, especially if you don't even have coronavirus, right? If you're quarantining people without the virus, that's not quarantine. That's imprisonment, right? Right. Right. And so we've made a lot of mistakes. And this is one of the great consequences of that, right? The alcoholism in the UK. You're not letting people go outside. You're not letting people enjoy their lives in any way whatsoever. What do you think is going to happen? Of course people are going to get depressed. Of course people are going to turn to alcoholism. Of course people are going to turn to drug use. Of course people are going to, turn to self-destructive things like suicide. Suicides are going to go up. And, I mean, one thing I think is a huge problem, people are talking about how Joe Biden's welfare, this is something I was actually going to report on. Joe Biden's welfare actually discouraged people from going back to work because there's so much welfare now in terms of COVID aid and other kinds of things that they're putting out there, that when people have the opportunity to go back to work, they're just like, I don't need to go back to work. I'm getting free money from the government. And it becomes a disincentive for them to go out to work. But I don't think that's the whole story. I think that's most of the story. But I think there's a big thing that we're missing here, and that this is something that I actually think that the Biden administration could capitalize on if they would recognize this and talk about it. But they're so trapped in their sort of delusional bubble of leftism that they don't even see realities that could actually help them in terms of public relations and in terms of their public image. But I do think that a big part of the problem is that people who would otherwise want to work and feel as if they are contributing to society and doing something good and whatnot, have become very comfortable not doing anything, right? And what do I mean by that? So I get burned out a lot when I do this show, right? And so I'll take a week off sometimes. And when I take a week off, not very often, but maybe like 3 times a year, I'll take a week off and I'll just do nothing. And I literally mean do nothing, right? Even when I go on vacation, I usually do some videos. But there's certain weeks where I'm just like, okay, I'm burned out. I need to sort of regain my ability to do videos. And I will just watch TV for a week, maybe play a video game. I don't even like video games, but I'll just play a video game just to get... I want to get politics out of my head. The whole concept of me taking these breaks, and usually they're not a full week. Maybe they're like 3 or 4 days. But I want to purge all the politics out. I want to purge everything about work out of my system. But if I take too long of a break, and if I get too comfortable just sitting around doing nothing, what ends up happening is that becomes my routine. And changing that up and getting back to work seems like an unpleasant process. We have an aversion, I think, to transitioning from one state to another, because you have to have that acceleration, right? Once you got the ball rolling, like if I'm doing a show every single day, it's really easy for me to do a show every single day because I'm in that habit, right? But if I don't have any momentum, if I'm just sitting there and I haven't done anything for a week, I'm like, okay, what am I supposed to do again? Okay, I got to research something and write something down. And, the whole process is like, I got to gather up all my things. And the best way for me to get started is to find a topic that I'm enthusiastic about, to get inspired by, right? And that's usually how I start back up. If I've taken a couple of days off and I see a story that really inspires me, I get back to work and then I'm back on a roll, right? So, I mean... so that's just me after a few days of taking a break. Imagine these people who have been taking months off of work, months, and they're making a decent amount of money just sitting at home doing nothing, playing their video games, doing nothing. So this prospect of getting back to work, of transitioning from a sedentary state back into an active state, that's difficult for them, right? It's like being on a nice warm day, jumping into ice cold water. It sounds like nice and refreshing, but once you stick your toe in, you're like, oh man, I don't know if I want to get into that. But then once you get in, it's actually quite nice. It's actually not that cold, but it's that transition, right? It's that transition that is a little bit unpleasant. And yeah, the transition, I think, from the sedentary life of taking money from the government and getting back to work, I think is very daunting for a lot of people. And so I think that the Biden administration is dealing with that as well. If people are in a position where they're suffering a little bit, they're struggling, they're like, okay, I'm a little bit nervous, I'm stressed out, how am I going to pay my rent? How am I going to buy food? How am I going to, get my life together? Then they're going to desperately be looking for a job, and there's plenty of jobs available right now. So, maybe cutting out a lot of this COVID aid might actually be the best solution at this point. They maybe were passing it out for a little bit too long at this point. But the Biden administration, they don't want to take any kind of responsibility for anything negative that ever happens, of course, so they deny it. I suppose that's natural for a politician, but we all know it's BS. They're causing a much bigger problem. Again, the solution is sometimes worse than the original problem, and in this case, I think the Biden administration and various governments around the world have created more problems than they have been able to help stop the spread of the coronavirus. I don't know if really many of the problem-solving methods that have been used over the past year have really been terribly effective. But what they have been effective at doing is bankrupting people, making people depressed, turning people to alcohol, turning people to suicide, all kinds of negative consequences. So, it's quite sad how this was all mishandled. And it's easy to criticize. It's, I think, harder to implement appropriate actions. But some people implemented great responses. I think letting people be free is always sort of like the best go-to. You want people to be as free as possible as much of the time as possible, to do what they think is best for themselves. And I think trying to micromanage, I think actually this is a really great lesson for all of Americans to see exactly how the government will act when they get a lot more power, right? Because AOC and all the socialists in America, they want the government to run everything. Okay. So look what happened when they had the power during the pandemic, when they could lock people down into their homes, when they could kill businesses. They did just that. They did all of the nasty things that we expect them to do. They mismanaged everything. They messed everything up. So this idea of giving the federal government more power, giving governments more power, you can see where that goes. Anyway, that's it for my discussion about alcoholism in England. Let's move on to the next story, shall we? Ellen DeGeneres is ending her show as her ratings plummet. I don't know how much anybody cares about this story, but let's have a look. I think it's interesting. Ellen DeGeneres, a popular TV show. It's funny. Toxic Masculinity, weekdays, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific.